I know that many of you are joining, and we have viewers coming in. Uh, I will be starting the webinar at exactly 2:04 p.m. here, which is in a couple of minutes. And we always start at this time because we want to give people a chance to gather. But we're glad that you've joined us, and we will start very, very soon. So just wait, and then we will begin the seminar. Okay, well, it's 2:04, and so it's time to begin the seminar. And this is the third lecture that we've had on the special of Central Asia and mission. And it's really an honor today to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Barakatullo Asarov, who is on the faculty of Boston College. His research and teaching focus on the history of religions, cultures, and languages of ancient Iran, encompassing the modern territories of Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and Central Asian countries. One of his primary scholarly foci is the history of Eastern Syriac Christianity among Iranian and Turkic-speaking ethno-linguistic communities of West and Central Asia. More specifically, his interests include the Syriac Christian tradition among Sogdians, or in more general, the spread of the East Syrian tradition along the Silk Roads and other philosophical and religious movements of the ancient Iranian world. And so with that, I turn it over to you, Barakatullo, and go ahead and take the lecture from there. Are you muted? Barakatullo, are you muted? Okay. No, I'm not hearing you. Why is that? I can't hear you. I wonder if it's mine or yeah, the sound went. Here, let me just check really quick. Let me mute and unmute. Muted. Now I'm not. Try Barakatullo. Try muting yourself and unmuting yourself. Oh dear. Go ahead and speak, Barakatullo. Yeah, I'm not hearing. It was working a second ago. What? I've got everything on. I'm sending messages out to my No, we can't. Nobody can hear you. Something happened to your sound. Um, what I recommend, Barakatullo, is go ahead and go out and come back in because you were in before. Go ahead and leave and come back, and we'll just extend the seminar as long as it takes because they can't hear you either, but they can hear me. Okay, now you're on mute. Go ahead, go off mute, Barakatullo. You're on mute. Yeah, it's the little microphone on the icons just above our pictures. Okay, just above our pictures on the right, there's a microphone. And you're, let me see if I can unmute you. No? Okay, just a second. Okay, speak to me now, Barakatullo.
Hello, hello.
Oh, there you go. Okay, you're okay.
Yeah.
So here we go. Let's go again. All right, start from the beginning.
Good morning from Boston, and I think it is afternoon in England, or maybe wherever that you're joining for this webinar. First of all, I wanted to say thanks to Professor Tom Harvey for this kind invitation to give this lecture for Oxford Center for Mission Studies. And I certainly have a good memories of visiting the center, and I follow the works and publications that happens there. And for today's lecture, the theme that I have chosen is devoted to the history of the Church of the East, which is today accepted to be one of the oldest Christian communions. Now, when I say that this is the Church of the East, I wanted to give some disclosures. We don't have enough time to say everything that we should say or we know about Church of the East, given the fact that there is so many approaches to studies on the Church of the East applied today, starting the end of 19th century till today, and certainly the surge of the new studies that came up in the middle of the 20th century until now. So many people study the history of the Church of the East from the mission studies perspective. Certainly the scholars of the Syriac language and culture, they study it textually, as there is a very abundant amount of literary heritage left by the Syriac writers. And people involved in art history, they study the Church of the East from the art perspective because they have left us also many artistic heritage. But given the fact that the Church of the East concentrated on reaching the mandate that was given to the Christians by Jesus, go and preach. So my approach to the study of the Church of the East more from the ethnic and anthropological perspective. But since the testimony from the anthropological communities are not big enough quantitatively, so then I try to draw in also attestation and testimonies from the subsidiary or the auxiliary disciplines like art and archaeology. So for today, I want to just put this out that for today there are about 400,000 members of the Church of the East, both in their homelands in Mesopotamia, in Iraq and Syria, as well as a smaller community in Iran, and then there is a larger communities that they survive or they live in diaspora in Europe and North America, including also Australia and New Zealand. So for our lecture today, I will be focusing on the textual archaeological evidence from the Sassanid to the Timurid dynasty period that spans the vast geographical expanse from Mesopotamia to China. Now, as I try to be as selective as possible, and obviously there are volumes written now for the Church of the East. So therefore, if any participants find something missing in my lecture, it is not that I won't deliberately put that away, but it is just for the sake of time that we have today. So, and my interest, I wanted just to highlight that my interest in the study of the Church of the East came to be that when I first learned about, when I was studying the Old and Middle Iranian linguistic in St. Petersburg State University, and then I said I wanted to study the Sogdian language. And this was a lingua franca. Sogdian language was a lingua franca of the Euro-Asian continent for millennia. Mm. And original geography of Sogdians being concentrated in modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan gave me a sense of patriotism that, these are my ancestors. I want to study, this language. And soon after that, I discovered that Sogdians, they have left this bulk of literature that is Christian. And then that even increased more my interest in learning more about that. So, and hence then I'm involved in researching about the Church of the East among the Iranian speaking nations, not, particularly focusing on Sogdians and how the introduction of Christianity influenced Sogdian culture, at the same time giving a stimuli in a rise of the new artistic and literary endeavors, and then also how this also shaped their identities during the troublesome periods, like when they were living in China during the Tang Dynasty, and then when they had to change their names from Sogdian into Mandarin Chinese, but at the same time, this the Christian identity and belonging was something that they couldn't conceal, and they kept it up front. So therefore, this is the points of the interest that I have. But today we will go on looking at the topic as broad as it is possible, and I hope that this introduction will be useful. When we're talking about the Church of the East, so the first thing is that when we say Church of the East, it probably presumes that there is also Church of the West. This dichotomy, that when we're dividing something and naming it the Church of the East, so there is also Church of the West. Now, when we're talking about in this thing, we have to realize that both the Church of the East and the Church of the West, they grew from the same footing. They origin from the same footing at the end of the first century in the outskirts of Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. But then geopolitical divisions meant that this Church of the East and the Church of the West, and they took a separate path in their future development and growth. And when we're talking about the Church of the East, and these two maps that are showing there, so one of this map is the map of the Sasanian period, the Middle East and Sasanian period. Another one is the map of the Silk Road, showing that how the ancient world was connected through the trade routes and through different political, relationship that was set up. And our starting point is that when the Church of the East and where it began and how it went forward to become the Church of the East that we want to talk about today. And the first reference that starting from the 1960s of the last century, taken that the beginning of the spread of Christianity and its becoming as the Oriental Church or the Church of the East is found in New Testament in the book of Acts. The book of the Acts is very interesting to the fact that that in a missiological or in a New Testament studies, people say the table of nations. So it records and gives the names of different nations that were present on the day of Pentecost. And then during this, the coming of the Holy Spirit, the apostles spoke the gospel, and then all these people heard the gospel in their own language, and then they said, oh, we are Parthians, or we are Arabs, we are from Cappadocia, we are from this place and that place. So the emergence of the Church of the East is there, because from that table of nations we can see and we can highlight that there are several ethno-linguistic names that they all certainly belonged to be outside of the Roman Empire and to be much further. Particularly Parthian at that time, the Parthians occupied what is territory of modern Turkmenistan and parts of Iran and then Afghanistan, for example, where the Elam was central Iran. But aside from the New Testament records, then when we're moving into more, to different sources that we have, then we have the book of the laws of the countries by Bardasian, the disciple of, or the student of Philip, the philosopher. And in his book of the laws of the countries, which is the early 2nd century, we find that he already records, and then he says that there are people, there are Christians in Gilan, which is near the Caspian region of Iran. And then he also mentions about Beth Kashan in Syriac, which means, that later they identified that this is the Kushan period. Now, the Kushan was in that century. In 2nd century, the Kushan dynasty covered Afghanistan and parts of India and larger part of, the Central Asia. So we don't exactly know which Kushanians he refers to. However, later as the scholars, studied this, then they said that, particularly maybe we can see that the Eusebius, when he writes in his writing, in Prapatia Evangelica, in early 4th century, Eusebius mentions that this is Bactria. The Kushans of Bardasian is Bactria. And so if we take the side of the Eusebius, then in this case, then we can say that in 2nd century, Bardasian was informing us that the members of the church was already both in the Gilan, in Caspian region, in Turkmenistan, Iran frontier, as well as in what is modern Afghanistan. And the early spread and the origin of the Church of the East has a lot of histories that are entangled into a different traditions that came down to us. These are the tradition of what we call it apostolic tradition of Mar Thoma, Mar Adai, and Mar Agai, and also the Syriac doctrine of the apostles that is also from the that 3rd century. And in these traditions, we find out that the communication between the area of the Church of the West and the Church of the East was very long, and it started from the at the time when probably Jesus still was alive. But more academically and scientifically, when we want to attach this testimony of these traditions to the evidence, then we move a little bit away from them, because this is a tradition, it is respected, but we cannot find certain tangible proofs that we can support it. However, in the later period, we have this the 8th century Syriac work known as a Synodicon Orientale, known by its French name because the Jean Chabot, who edited this. And this is the collection of the synods of the Church of the East. And it begins from the 410 from the Synod of Mar Isaac and Seleucus the Siphon, and then goes on until the last the Synod of Yusuf. And the Synodicon Orientale becomes a more historically accurate data for us that can help us to map the geography of expansion of the Church of the East from the earliest time. Particularly, what is important important information in Synodicon is that at the end of every synod, there is a long list of the signatories. And many of these bishops, metropolitans, archbishops who came from the far and near, who were part of the Church of the East, they put their names and where they come from. And so through these, then we can verify then the later attestations, because the Syriac historiography is very rich in a sense that they have been producing chronicles from the 3rd century onward, and then particularly the later 10, 11, 12th century Syriac chronicles. I found this on the web for what's a college at. I am very sorry, my when I say Syriac, my iPhone hears Siri. And so my iPhone started reacting, so that the iPhone doesn't know that we're not talking about Siri. I'm sorry about that. So that started talking to me that, Siri started talking to me now. I apologize for that. And so in a Synodicon Orientale, then we look into the names of different bishops and representative of the church that came in the geography. Then we can connect that name with the material data, either archaeological or we connect it with the textual data, the references that has come to us certainly through both the Syriac authors and the Arab Muslims. It is important, for example, in the history of the Church of the East to look into the At-Tabari, which is the father of the Arabic historiography, as well as Muqaddasi and Yaqubi. Both of these Arab historians that they have written extensively on historical geography of the both Iran and Central Asia. And then later, particularly, then it becomes that then they corroborate, and we find that the intertextual relationship between the Arabic Muslim historians and the Syriac Christian historians writing about this history. Now, when we're moving from these references to the Church of the East and its birth and development, in the early history, then there are these two significant points that I selected to be very important to know. And this is particularly in terms of the geopolitical conditions of that time. So first we look into the moment in terms of the Parthian dynasty. It was not very long-lived dynasty, but it was a dynasty that it is known to be not true Iranian. They were very keen to absorb and to continue the Greek Hellenistic elements. And so they had their own form of the governance, and they're very relaxed. And the period of Parthians becomes crucial, as this is also the period that they were trying to get closer to the West, to the Roman Empire. And this facilitated, obviously, a greater exchange between people living under the Parthian dynasty as well as people living in the Roman dynasty, in the Roman Empire. And the integration of Christians, or the mobility under the Parthians, then became crucial for the subsequent Sassanid dynasty that rose, because by the time that the Sassanids came, so there were obviously the Jews and Aramaic-speaking communities lived in Persian Empire since the time of the Xerxes, during the exiles, the people who remained there. And the Parthians, many of these Jewish and Aramaic-speaking communities already were evangelized, and as we know that the starting point of Christian mission, as we see on the New Testament and also outside the New Testament history, that the point of contact was first the Jewish community and then the others. And so by the time of the Sassanids, so there was a large, scale in Judeo, the Jewish and Aramaic communities that were evangelized. And then when the Sassanid dynasty comes over, what it happens at the Sassanids, and they said, oh, the Parthians, they were cursed. They were really not good. They destroyed our identity, that we are the people, that we have this connectivity with Cyrus, that we are part of this Achaemenids. We have this, and the Sassanid dynasty comes, and then the revival of the Zoroastrian tradition begins. And the increase of this revivalist movement in Zoroastrian tradition and declaring it as a state religion. So it is under the Sassanids that Zoroastrianism becomes a state religion in Persia or in Iran. And that also affected, it is not just that it is only the atmosphere, the religious atmosphere in the capital changes, but also it changes throughout the empire as it continues on. And then when the Zoroastrian hierarchy is established and the priesthood is part in the Zoroastrian tradition, the priesthood or the office of Mobad was part of the political elite. So they had to also the right to say of how to govern the country. And at this time, then they come to face to say that, oh, so we have Jews, we have Christians, we have this, so what to do with them? And so these political conditions then becomes, this condition becomes important in forming the Church of the East into what we can call it a Persian church. This is the period of the Sassanid is the time when the Syriac speaking Holy Apostolic Assyrian Church of the East transits or takes the form of the Persian church. And I think that Professor Bach, Christopher Bach, he rightfully mentions that, that the Church of the East is Persian because of its geopolitical position. It was in a Persian empire, but it was also Persian in a sense of its employing the Persian tongue, and then also that it was governed, with the laws of the Persia. And then in this, when we can see that the idea of the Church of the East having a Syriac language but being Persian becomes then a point of reference. So these are the Persian. The Sassanid period also then, for the Sassanid period also, these two aspects of the society is crucial to see that was key in the growth of the Christian communities across the empire, from Seleucus to Siphon where the Euphrates and Tigris River basin, all the way to the other end in Central Asia. The first point is that we need to look at the idea of migration. When Sassanians were rising in power and declared Zoroastrianism as their state religion, this coincided with a time when Rome also was rising in its in authority and power. And then this was also the time when they declared Christianity as their state religion, imperial religion. And outside of this ideological conflict of discourse, Sassanians and Romans, they also fought over, that taking the lands that once they lost, and then they occupying. And this continued warfare between the Rome and Persia provided this milieu that people were mobile. They were migrating during the war, and then some of them were captured and then resettled. Particularly, we know that parts of the Khuzestan or the western in western Iranian plateau. So there was groups of people that were deported. They brought from the Roman cities of the Antioch or Odessa, and they were resettled in Iranian mainland. And some of them, when they came, so then they had the profession. If they before had to travel as a Roman merchant to Persia, now they are Roman living in Persia. So they had now greater mobility to travel within the Persian Empire, going, either through the marine route to the south coast in China, in Fujian, or going on land through Central Asia. And so this migration and the refugee movement then brought people that were diverse in both their ethnicity, in both of their social backgrounds, and these were people who also were brought up in a different economic settings. Not every deportee or refugee came, from the impoverished, peasant communities. These immigrated, or these refugees certainly included also the learned people. These were people who were involved in learned societies. They were part of the probably different schools, or they had their own trades. And so, under these two movements of migration and refugees, then we see that also the increase of trade at this time starts growing. Sassanid Empire wanted to model itself as the Achaemenids did. Achaemenids came and then they absorbed the Babylonian and the Elamite kingdoms, and then they set up their own kingdom, and they brought in resources from every provinces or the satrapies that they had. And so the Sassanid Empire. And so for them, maintaining this trade routes becomes important. And so hence I put there the map of the Silk Road, because when we're looking into the mission of the Church of the East, or the becoming of the Church of the East as the Persian church, and then extending far and beyond of the limits of what the modern Iran is, the idea of Silk Road becomes also important. And it wasn't that this was just only the the using of the trade as the profession, but it was that they often, these traders, they would, be joined by different other social groups. There were people trading commodities, taking spices from Iran to Central Asia, but there were people who were just going and learning and recording. And so then this is how the Christian faith also moved. Now, when in this commodity and faith exchange, as it is happening at this time, we find that at this time, the church is being established and reorganized step by step. When we're looking at the history of the Church of the East, what it says, and then we also look into the Pahlavi Zoroastrian text, and then at the same time, when we're looking into, say, the Jewish text, say Babylonian Talmud, or later the Judeo-Persian literature, so we see that simultaneously all different religious groups, they are moving inside empire as different groups, and then they are crystallizing and forming their own communities. So it is not that they are moving, they are keeping themselves as a separate, but they are integrating themselves. They are learning into negotiating their rights as a citizens. They are learning to negotiate their presence in this social economic hierarchy. And as such, we see that the employment of the local linguistic tools becomes paramount. So they employ, obviously, Syriac in the church as the sacred language, the language of the church, lingua sacra. But outside the church, they had to communicate in Pahlavi, in the language of empire. So this representation of what I would call it, the representation of the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth into two linguistic domains becomes very interesting point to see. We find in the Syriac sources that there was the division among the bishops in Iran, and then they were debating in terms of the superiority of the Syriac language, and saying this is the language of our fathers. They spoke, and we cannot change it. You know that we have to keep this. But the other one says that yes, but this is the language also of the, of Shah, the emperor, who has granted us freedom of worship. So this is also another topic that is interesting to follow. But that as we moving into to look at it, that how the Church of the East was forming itself and establishing itself in society as a community, as a church, we then also need to look into the theological atmosphere that also was forming and shaping this process. As the Church of the East was developing in the Zoroastrian context, what was the theological context there? So we see that the rise of the Kartir, or they call it Kirdar, the high priest, that he has put his own inscription in the Zoroaster Skub, or the Kabbai Zardosht, where he mentions all different religions that is evil religion. And he includes also, that he includes Manichaeans, but he also includes also Christians. So the theological milieu of the Sassanid Empire was very intense, in a sense that for the Church of the East to theologically formulate and represent itself, they had to come up, that they had to choose an approach that would not alienate them, but would keep them as a part of that the Persian mentality. But at the same time, this theological atmosphere, we also need to consider what was going on in the Church of the West. As they were trying in the West to formulate different aspects of Christology and theology, so we know about the 4th and 5th century down to the Chalcedon. We know that about how this the drama was unfolded, particularly the Council of Ephesus in 424, when this the rivalry between the Cyril of Alexandria and Nestor, the Patriarch of Constantinople, arose, and one was banished and to exile, and from then forth we can see that then the Church of the East, in the eyes of the Church of the West, was heretical. And this was the heresy or the anathema that lasted for so long. It was lifted only in 1996, I believe, by Pope John Paul II. So this theological intensity and animosity that came between the Church of the East and the Church of the West then gave extra push for the Church of the East to secure its position as an independent church. And so then we will look at this, that if the Synod of Mar Isaac in 410, under the Ardashir, he declares himself that he is the Catholicos, and then in 14 years later, the Synod of Dadi Shah in 424 declares the Church of the East totally autocephalous and independent from the Antioch and from the Byzantine, totally. And this was for their own benefit. They sought to see that what would be for us to either to carrying on to be under the anathema that we are carrying, or to carry on the mission that we have and what we believe. Now, many people would take interest in this moment to look into the theological correctness, or the orthodoxy, as we can say it, of the Church of the East and the Church of the West at this point. And I can say that both of these synods, the first, the 410 and 424, both of these synods, they have confirmed the Nicene Creed. So both of these synods, they say that, that they are following the Nicene formula that was set out in the Synod of Nicaea, obviously. And so from that respect, I think that it is encouraging that we can see that, the biblical teaching that was in the Church of the East was not apocryphal, or it was not something non-biblical. Now, obviously, this formation of the faith formula within the Church of the East and establishing its hierarchy, and then, as they saw that the new bishoprics and the new metropolitanate and the new ecclesiastical sees were formed throughout the Persian Empire, then this also meant that they were coming into a new forms of communication or dialogue with the state. Many historians of the Church of the East refer and look into the Acts, the hagiographical writings in Syriac, and particularly one of the highlighted, or the big one, is the Acts of the Persian martyrs. Mm. And so the first view that we see that the Church of the East, and some people even refer to it as a martyr church. But this idea of the Church of the East being a martyr church has been, to a certain extent criticized and refuted by the fact that the persecutions that we read in a hagiographical literature and the oppression of Christians under the Persian monarch in a Sassanid period has to be distinguished whether this was a systematic massive or this was something that individually, agitated accident. And we come to this idea that how the socio-political integration of the Christians as it was happening. Every bishop, they had the freedom of having their own jurisdiction, being responsible for the welfare of the people that they were looking after. And they were also responsible for looking, for responsible for giving a tax, and paying a tax to the government, and also regulating a common civic law, this common civic Austrian law. And it was a violation of this contractual agreement between the bishops that often brought the persecution. And the persecution obviously was first directed just to the bishop. For example, the story of Mar Shemun, the martyrdom of Mar Shemun, or the Simon, for example, is one of the example. Or the hagiography of Mar Qadraha also narrates the similar story. So hence, we, when looking into this, the social organization of the church, we see that the Christians are becoming part of the elite, part of the imperial elite. So they are part of the group, and then they're integrating. And how this then social political integration helped them? First thing, that obviously this integration supported they gaining deeper roots and gaining patronage, being protected by the state. The Synod of 410 declares that the churches has to be built, the monasteries has to be rebuilt, and and so if we're looking in this, then we see that, perhaps Ardashir is referring to all the destructions that come under the Shapur II, his predecessor. And so then, from that on, then we will move, and then we say that, okay, so this social integration meant a greater investment from both the resource that the empire dedicated, as well as resources that the church had in its possession. And from this regard, the archaeology gives us a magnificent picture. So then we all look into this, the churches that were discovered in the Gulf region and in Iran itself. So we can see from the outlines, we can see that how magnificent these churches were. From, if we don't have a very precise demographical data, how many people were there, but just calculating in terms of the size and the shape of these edifices, many archaeologists, including Reuter and Fier and many other European archaeologists who excavated these churches, they said that this were a cathedral churches meant to attract at least 1,000 or a couple thousand people. This were not, this were the churches that they, and one can say that if these churches were meant to represent glory and authority and power of Christian community, or could also argue that though this was built realistically to accommodate this number of people. But when we're looking into this architecture, then we can also come to see that, okay, so what does architecture model says about this integration of faith into the landscape? Any architecture, any building that we build in any surface of earth changes that landscape. There is a park in front of my house, and tomorrow I erect a house there, and then it already changes. So how these churches then change that landscape is important, because the architecture embodied that visibility of this community. It represented that that this is this grand cathedral. It stays there, and then it shows that there is people who go in and come out, and aside to this, on this architecture, then we also, if we go deeper into the evolution of the Church of East architecture, then also becomes important. What we see that on the basis of the Church of the East architecture, or its ecclesiastical architecture, we see a basic principle of the Ivan architecture that was born in Central Asia. And this architecture model, kind of, a P shape or, form, was taken from Central Asia by Parthians, and they brought, and then they joined this form architecture with the Babylonian temple architecture, the strict square, template. And after these two joined together, and so then this symbiosis, that this joining together of two different architectural models then gave birth to a new model, which is specific only to the Church of the East. Obviously, certain of its, let us say the geographical or the compass orientation, east to west axis, etc., makes it similar to the basilica models that was also common in the West, in the Roman Church, but it had more to it that spoke of its being a Persian. The Church of the East distinguished itself. This integration meant that they distinguished themselves not just only by having their own Autokephalios patriarch, which then they became to call as a Catholicos from 424, but then they also had their own form of the architectural identity. And this architectural identity was something that further, if we look into how Manichaean Church, there's another, the Manichaean Church has developed its own architecture, and particularly the inclusion of Bema and the festival of Bema in Manichaeans and in Christian tradition becomes then the next level of interaction or communication between the Church of the East and its mission to show its local nature. Professor Brock, Sebastian Brock, has masterfully written about how the the misnomer that gave the name of Nestorian, and how the idea of being politically loyal to the Persians and kind of being always suspected to be agent of the Roman, the enemy empire, always played role in the life of the Church of the East. And from this regard, when we're looking in the architecture, we see that they are very careful not to build the churches in the model of basilica, the municipal buildings of the Rome, but some of these grand churches, particularly the patriarchal church of the Seleucus, the Siphon, we can see that it echoes already the royal palaces of the Persian kings. The later Persian kings, the palaces have a greater, similarity in architectural features that we can see in the Church of the East architecture. And this architecture dialogue and this architectural representation is not just only in the territory of the West Asia, which is Iran, Iraq, Syria, but this is also seen in Central Asia, in Turkmenistan, in Kyrgyzstan, in Uzbekistan, and we also see this in China. In Turfan Oasis, we see this, that this the architectural dialogue. Out of these buildings, then obviously we're speaking about that these people communicated in Pahlavi. So hence my title was that out of Syriac into Pahlavi. And now translating architectural model of the church into the Oriental or the Persian, now they also had it translated into a scripture. Sadly, we have only one specimen in literature, which I will come later. But a greater infusion or the dialogue of being integrated comes when we study the xylography, the personal seals, and then also numismatics. What we see that the prototype of the Sasanian coinage was always the bust of the king in front and the fire altar with attendants at the back. So on the obverse, it always shows the emperor, and on reverse, it shows then the fire altar. Now, obviously, the Sassanids, they had a different emission. So they had the both in the silver and the Sassanian silver drachm, and then we also have a copper. So what we see that in a different mint, so we can see that there are a new symbolism introduced. I apologize if these images are not very, clear for you maybe to see it, but this is, for example, a silver drachm of the Varahan. And obviously the reverse side is intact as it is, but in here we see that it has the cross, or what some people call a Syrian or the Palestinian cross, or the equatorial, the cross with the equal arms that was characteristic of the Church of the East. Now, how this introduction of the Christian symbol would influence then the monetary circulation and then the exchange value of these coins with commodity. Would introduction of the new symbol in the coin puts the value less, or how? But it is, that these are the questions that would be, good to discuss, but in an economical history aspect. To move on, if you look at the lower coin here, these are the copper coins of Yazdgirt that, and then also we have also from Ardashir that were found in Merv, the city of Merv, which is in modern Turkmenistan. And what do we see? There is total absence of fire altar. So we see that the Zoroastrian symbol is completely now removed, and it is replaced by the cross and then the same rising ribbons. Similar representation we notice in the personal seals. And certainly the personal seals, all of them have a Pahlavi inscription. So there are the person's name, or either there is his office, like there is a person called Marzban. Now, Marzban is administrative officer's name, like a head of the prefecture or something. And this idea of how the political, social, economic integration that we see from Iran in West Asia, in the mainland, is also observed further afield within the empire going to China, which we will come to that in a moment. Now, when we're talking about the literally, so it becomes that the only Pahlavi testimony in a biblical literature is a Pahlavi Psalter. That as we can see that the Philip Genoux, who studied this, it says that this fragment is the oldest linguistic testimony of Pahlavi literature, the manuscript probably having been written in the 6th or 7th century. Around 2010 or 11, it was carbon dated, and so it shows that this is 4th century. Mm. Obviously, this codex is a 12 page. So the carbon dating was made from 1 page. So that particular page, carbon dating shows that it is from the 4th century. But paleographically, we see that the Pahlavi Psalter from the book Pahlavi. The book Pahlavi is a script that was employed for writing Zoroastrian literature. So this shows a number of archaic features that is not present in the later Pahlavi literature, Zoroastrian literature. So from this regards, we can see how ancient this is, and this book was found only in Turfan Oasis with other Christian literature in Iranian languages, including the Sogdian and Uyghur material. But I think that it is my approach is that we look into qualitatively, not quantitatively. So to focus that even that we have this, so obviously there was increase of the Zoroastrian influence in the production of the books of the secular and religious nature. And I think that the loss or the absence of the Christian Pahlavi literature should be connected with that. Because certainly when we are analyzing the book culture among the Jewish living in Persia and the Sassanids and then Christians and Zoroastrian, so this absence that they were destroyed and they were deliberately not produced should be, connected together. And aside, we know that the art of writing, the art of writing among the Syriacs were great, because we know that the Syriac was used as a translation vehicle for translating from Greek into Syriac, and then from Syriac into Arabic, and late Ole Islamic resonance owes all the literature or the science that was translated to the Syriac writers. Now, aside from the architecture and from the literature, then we have also a testimony in the other personal objects, and particularly I want to highlight this a processional cross that was found in the city of Herat. And now we know that from the ecclesiastical history of the Church of the East, that both Herat and Balkh and Merv, all these 3 cities out in Khorasan, they were important metropolitan cities. And so this processional cross, which liturgically was important for carrying, so it was it is a big testimony to that history. And the cross has Pahlavi inscriptions giving the name, and then there is also prayer. On one side is a prayer, on the other side is the name of the person, that who executed it. Part of it is missing, but this object then shows that if we're looking into the seals, so that's a personal, my seal, for example, like many people today, they can order their own personal little stamp that they can put with the address on the envelope. So it's something that's very personal. And on the other hand, if you see the coins, so the coins is a part of the larger So that's an exchange and then intercirculated. And then when we're looking into the book and into the processional, then this puts from the individual and the socio-economic into this specific liturgical community. So this is the object that communicates in both communal, corporate way what they believe and how they believe and where they come from. And certainly having a Pahlavi in Herat, so it already shows the expansion of this medium, expansion of this Pahlavi medium to communicate the gospel. Yes, the Syriac remained exclusive church language for the Church of the East. But between reciting the liturgy and giving a homily or communicating the gospel in a personal level, it was always a local language. And this is something that is a specific characteristic of the Church of the East. Unlike in the Western Church, where the Latin becomes prominent, everything is Latin and no other local languages until the Reformation. But for the Church of the East, from the start, it was that they reserved Syriac for delivering the liturgy, but the homilies and then the communication happened always in a local language. Now, since we went into Herat, so we will go further from Herat, and now we will go to the region that is closer to my home country, to the region of Sogdiana. Now, when we come to Sogdiana, so as I said, so we see the similar pattern. This is probably the biggest question. Everyone says, when did Christianity came to Central Asia? Now, this division of the Central Asia, and Iran, so this is a bit tricky and it is more than understanding. There was no Central Asia when Christianity went there. It was just the Persian Empire. And locally, people were divided. The regions were divided as a Khwarezmiya, Bactria, Sogdiana, based on their ethno-linguistic identity. So when it came to Sogdiana, this is a big question. And I think that in a couple of my publications on the Sogdian coins and their architecture, I have argued that we need to connect the arrival of Christianity to Sogdiana with Merv, 4th century. But certainly by the 7th century, in the territory of Central Asia, in the center of the Central Asia, what is Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, taken together, these three regions. So by the 7th century, we had already a well-established Christian communities. And one of the testimony to that is the church excavated in early 2000 in Urgut region, which is in the vicinity of Samarkand. Now, when we're looking into this, the church in the architectural context of the Church of the East, so we see it is echoing the same architectural models that we see in Iraq and northern Syria and in Iran proper. And in addition to this echoing architectural model, what Urgut church is located in in a mountainous area where there are many Syriac inscriptions were found. They all are in Syriac, and there are personal names, and there is a short, maybe the beginning of a prayer or the word like vigil, for example. And there is one couple of the Turkic names and then one Iranian or the Sogdian name, Bakht. So, and what we see here that between the architecture and then inscriptional testimony, we see again the same dialogue repeated. The Urgut church is believed that was built around the early 7th century and it was occupied and used until the 13th century. So that's a very long occupation period. And of the Urgut church and a monastery, already we have a report of the early 10th century Arab geographer Ibn Hokal. He goes and then he narrates that in an area of Shaudar, which looks down to the Samarkand Sogd, there is this place where I met Christians from Iraq. By speaking that Christians from Iraq, he means a Syriac speaking, because the territory of Iraq at that time, Christian language was Syriac. And he said they have came here because of the climate is nice and etc. etc. And so we have this church. But beyond this church, then we have again the same idea that we see in Merv as the extremely eastern frontier of the Sassanid Empire and the central Iran. We see the same introduction of the new symbols into the coins. So these are the group of the coins that they were found in the Bukharan oasis in Samarkand. And at that time, this territory was what we call it the territory of the Western Sogd. And so we can clearly see the introduction of the cross. What is interesting in this, particularly in these two coins in the middle, so here, a square hole in the middle, this form of coin, which in Chinese was Yang Tuang Bao, the inaugural cash or inaugural coin in China. This form of coin was introduced in Sogdiana by early 7th century, when Varhuman, the Sogdian king, was officially appointed as a vassal by the Chinese emperor. And then they introduced this new coin. And the cross is not part of the original design. We can see that in this coin, they have preserved the Shi symbol, the Chinese symbol. And then they put one Sogdian inscription, and then they added a heraldic symbol or the tamga, but then they put cross. So this is not part of the original design. So this is premeditated, purposefully designed coin, which again speaks that this time we can see the integration of Christianity happening. Beyond Sogdiana, when we move, so then we go and then we see in the territory of Semiracia, so southern Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, then we see again the church architecture. And so when we're looking in the church architecture there, we see again the same elements that we see in Mesopotamia. So it's very interesting that the territory of Central Asia is situated so far away, but it is still looking vast in this. But at the same time, one element that distinguishes these churches found beyond Sogdiana in the territory of southern Kazakhstan is that these churches, they had open yards. In Urgut, in northern Syria, and in Tigris area, so we see that all the churches, they all were covered. But here it is open. And so, that Khmelnytsky and Voronina, some of the distinguished Russian architectural historians, when they analyzed, they said that this is a specific church model adapted for Central Asia, because here the climate is different than in Euphrates region or in Tigris region. And then besides, he said that the social gathering in Central Asia was different in nature too. And the church was a point when it was not just only a gathering of only the people of the church, but also the others. So then this open roof, halls was specifically designed for this territory. Now, as I mentioned, then we have also great variety of the textual testimony, and one of the biggest testimony that we have is this Sogdian translation of the Nicene Creed. The Sogdian manuscripts, Christian manuscripts, they are tentatively dated to be from 8th to down 11th century in that period. And no Christian text in Sogdian was ever found in the Sogdiana proper, in the territories of modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, but only in this, the repository of Bulaik monastery in Xinjiang, in China. However, if this text existed among the Sogdian speakers in China, we can assume that it also existed in Sogdiana, but it just didn't survive. And this, the textual transmission obviously kind of took time to go. And then among the textual tradition, it is not just Nicene Creed, but we find also a gospel lectionary, particularly the gospel lectionary today marked as a E5. And the complete edition of this text came a few years ago by a colleague of ours from Dr. Chiara Barbati. And this is a singular lectionary that is completely in Sogdian. There are other lectionaries which are bilingual. They have alternating lines with the Syriac and Sogdian. But this particular lectionary, which is complete, it is fully in Sogdian. Now, what does this say? Even if it is 11th century or 10th century, what is, aside from the debate on dating, what we can say that the church has moved completely into Sogdian.
Mm.
This is probably the time that was the time when the Syriac speaking, probably elders or Syriac proficiency among the church elders was declining. And there was a need then now a new church language to come.
Mm.
And this new church language then was chosen to be Sogdian. Besides Sogdian, then we have also then, the territory of Central Asia is the home of the Turkic speaking nations. And so obviously Old Uyghur or Uyghur language is older in the Turkic family. If you're looking at it hierarchically, it is older. And so the testimony from the Uyghur language is also another point to show this, integration of the new ethno-linguistic family into the Church of the East, the Uyghurs. And this is particularly important. This is a wedding blessing. The language is Uyghur, but it is written in Syriac. And Syriac script is interchangeably used in Central Asia. We have, for example, the fragments of Psalm written in a Sogdian cursive script, and the New Testament fragments, they are all written in a Syriac script. But the Syriac script that was used in Sogdian or in Uyghur was not the same Syriac script used in Mesopotamia, but with modification, because in Iranian language we have the sound of zh, for example, or we have different h or h, or in Uyghur case then k, the glottal k, So then they had to formulate or devise a new symbols to communicate these phonetical, peculiarities. But they have used the script to produce. Aside from this being completely in Uyghur and Syriac, then we have the Syriac text in Uyghur script. So this is a fragment of Psalm. The language is Syriac, the script is Uyghur. So now this also shows this different generation of the literary production. If there was the time that people could write in Syriac accurately, the transcribing Uyghur in a Syriac script, then in this time, we see that people don't know how to transcribe Uyghur into Syriac, but they know Syriac well enough to transcribe it in Uyghur script. So then we can see that this integration in the linguistic and in cognition is happening in different levels, indicating much greater and in-depth, growth as a part of the communal or characteristic of the church. Now we have also another testimony that we have is also the this prayer book. Now Peter Zime, who studied first the Uyghur part of it and then later Mark Deacon studied the Syriac portion of it, they both come to conclusion that this was a private prayer booklet, like a prayer book, a very small book And there are prayers in Syriac, and on the other face, the prayer is in Uyghur. And the Uyghur prayers are not the same prayers that are in Syriac. You know, they do follow the similar line, but they show much more different cultural understanding of those prayers. In a sense that they have learned that how to pray. And now, when we're talking, you know, that if we shift our focus in mission studies, so that when the disciples learn to pray in their own language, so what does it say? So it means that that is a church that is growing from their heart. Because of they are communicating, they are praying in the language of their heart. And so this testimony, I think it is one of the most intriguing, that even, you know, that even if a philologist will come errors that, oh, maybe they did not render the exactly letter or the same lining, but still, historically, this is important, and from the, you know, the anthropological studies, this is important because of we see this completely heart and mind transformation that these people, particularly considering that the entire Turkish Kaghanate and Uyghur Kaghanate later converts to Buddhism. If early the Turkish Kaghanate was Manichaean, they moved to Buddhism and then the Christianity. So this is very important. I think that I'm running out of my time. Am I?
Probably should close up in about 3 to 4 minutes, and then we can.
Okay. I just realized, you know, this is something that, you know, it is like, and in much later period when we go. So obviously we started from the Parthian period, which is 247 BCE, and now we're coming down into the Timurid and the later Mongol period. And the greater testimony for the presence of Christian in this territory of Central Asia are the tombstones.
Yeah. Okay.
And the tombstones were first discovered in the mid-19th century, and then throughout now they have been found again and again. And some of them were housed in a museum in Bishkek, former Frunze. After the museum got fired, they got lost, and then some found. But this whole corpus, over almost, you know, like 600 to 700 gravestones. And all these gravestones, they are richly ornamented with crosses. Some of them has angels, and they are written in two languages, Syriac and Turkic. And these gravestones, they tell us about the name of the deceased, the year of the death, and then when they're giving a dating, they use both the Turkic animal cycle, like they said that the year of the tiger, for example. But then they also show that, oh, you know, this was the Seleucid heir of so-and-so. So they use both the church calendar and they use their own cultural calendar for identifying the birth and the death years. In addition, many of these tombstones, they come with an epithet of who is there. So they tell, like, for example, there is a person who is designated as a musician. Another person is designated as a teacher. So we can see that this through analyzing the text from the tombstone corpus, we can come and see that these traditions that started in, you know, down in Euphrates, Tigris, in Mesopotamia, and carried on into Central Asia, continued well down to the 14th, 15th century. And I think that for modern history of Christianity in Central Asia, this ancient history becomes also important again, because of the new churches need to establish also their connectivity with the past churches. And certainly, I think that learning more on this history will benefit the modern inquiries in the history of Christianity in Central Asia. And it provides us different models of how the church and society communicated and dialogued, and how these two were integrated and coexisted peacefully. Thank you for your attention. Still, I have got a few things to say, but that can be scheduled for the next lecture.
Yeah, that could be the next one. Anyway, though, but thank you, Barakatullo. absolutely interesting, especially at the end when you began to tie it into the mission frame. All of it ties into that, but it was very helpful for me to see some of the significance of this. It led to a lot of questions on my own sense. Is as the church is moving up towards the Uyghurs and into Xinjiang and that area, and then it begins to bump into Chinese culture, as we see in the story in Stella in the so these are beginning to bump into each other. The question is, and this is just through my lack of knowledge, is first, is this movement through the Sassanid Empire when they're going up? Secondly, is Christianity a minority religion at this point, with Zoroastrianism as the main, all right, of which they live under? Or are they provinces to themselves that would affect mission and how people who were not Uyghurs be introducing Christianity to Uyghurs?
I think that if I understood your question correctly, yes, that Christians in Sassanid Iran, they were minority, but they were a big minority group.
Okay.
The big minority group, because Christians included very high officials. And if we look into the, what we call it, the biography of Barshaba, the bishop of Merv, we can see that even the queen converts. And then, you know, so that the Christianity was also in the Sasanian court.
Right.
And similar pattern, we see that the introduction of Christianity to China comes when Aluben arrives. And then Aluben comes, or he's given the title of Mar Aluben. And it's said about the story of Yazd Bozid. It's very Iranian name. Yazd Bozid means chosen by Yazd, which God. Yazdan is a plural in Middle Persian for gods, but Yazd Bozid means elected or chosen by God. And he comes and he says that he is related with a bishop from Balkh in Afghanistan. So I think that introduction of Christianity to that region of China came through the Middle Persian.
Okay.
But at the same time, we can see that at the time when Aluben arrives with his mission in 600 or 800, at that time, Sogdians already were living in China from 314.
Okay.
So they already were there, you know, like a couple centuries earlier. And certainly the Sogdian Christians, as we can see from the central China, there is a pillar, Luoyang pillar describing, so that, I mean, for the interest of time, I left them out. But so we can see that there was also Sogdians, and Sogdians were fluent. They could communicate between Middle Persian and Sogdian because of all the scholars we have studied, and we see the, you know, vocabulary base in Sogdian, which is borrowed from Middle Persian. And then also all the names of persons that is inscribed in the Shian stela tells us all the Middle Persian names. So these are all the people who are coming from Iran. And so I think that this introduction was through Middle Iranian, and it still, you know, made sense to them.
Yeah.
Was this your question, or
really helpful? And first, I want to say to everybody out there, if you have a question, put it into chat, and I will ask Barakatullo. The other thing I was absolutely fascinated because we have a student at OCMS that is looking at architecture, but they're looking at architecture in light of the Church of St. Thomas, which is tied to the Eastern Orthodox and Eastern churches as well. And what they're looking at is how the orientation of the St. Thomas churches actually begins to take on Indian Vastu types in terms of orientation of buildings. So the question is what's the orientation of those churches and those structures that you showed? Are they faced back towards the west, towards Jerusalem, or are they faced towards the east for the resurrection? Is there any orientation, and are there local elements that reflect the cosmology of how they understood the church to the surrounding landscape and understanding of the people of the relationship between the mundane and the divine?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the idea of the cosmology, how this cosmology was, included in the church, and how that was seen, I think uh, probably the only cosmological element that we could see is the dome
Yeah.
in the church. That when they had this dome, so which always represented this, the sky or the paradise.
Yeah.
But on the other side, they all are the churches that we, the documented churches. I think that they all are oriented to the east oriented.
Right.
They all are east oriented. I mean, often I think that in architecture they have used the sun as the navigation, how to go, that from sunrise to sunset direction. So some church building, there is a slight, deviation that it moves a little bit, like in the case of the church in Sogdiana, for example. But with communicating or integrating the surrounding elements, it is that first of all that obviously the architectural material used in church construction, the raw material that they employed, already dictates that they are part of the geology. They never imported things. Like when we're reading, for example, about the church built, and so we see that certain things were brought from somewhere, this from somewhere. Like even in Old Testament when they built the temple, so they were bringing material from different places. But in these church structures, we see that the architectural material are all local.
Yeah.
And this local architectural material, but then also what we see that the church architectural furnishing, the forms of the niche that they used for putting the lamps, or then even the form of this the decor that they use, that the stucco decoration, they use the decorating with crosses or vegetal ornamentation. But then also in the Church of the East, always they had their own what they call it, shakakona. This a narrow hallway that the bishop would come. And then the second important element in the Church of the East is the furnishing of bema in the middle of the church. And then during the celebration of bema, it was said that there was always a seat sitting in the middle with a 12, reflecting what the Revelation says, that what happens in the sky, so that they would duplicate that assembly in the heaven during the Bema festival. And so these are specific. I mean, when the roofing and some of the decors and etc. So all of this shows that they employed the local motives.
Let me ask you, I have questions from our architecture student who I just mentioned, and I will read her questions because they're very good. What factors of the Church of the East were considered as heretical until 1996 by the Church of the West? All right. What's the mission of architecture in the Church of the East? Does it have a particular aim that differs from the Church of the West? You mentioned some differences in the term of basilica model versus palace model, and some adaptations to climate conditions in particular areas, but I wonder if there are some mystical purposes in the indigenous architecture.
Oh, very good question. I think that first I need to say that I want to give as short answer as possible, because these questions, they cannot be justified by by a minute answer. The main factor that caused the Church of the East to be heretical comes into the Christology and the question of Mary. So this idea of that whether the Mary should be addressed as a Theotokos, God-bearer, or as a Christokos, as a Christ-bearer. Nestor's position was that because Christ had both divine and human nature. So to refer to Mary as a Christokos would satisfy, because people will confuse that if we call Mary Theotokos, the God-bearer, do we mean God the Father or God the Son? Which God? And to avoid this theological ambiguity, Nestor proposed that we should call her Christokos, because Christ is both human and divine. But this idea of that obviously the cult of Mary, how it was prevalent, especially in the northern Egypt, and the position of Cyril of Alexandria at that point became determinative to condemn Nestorius on this. And then obviously about the two nature of Christ. So therefore they call it either monophysite and miaphysite. So it had to do with the question of Christology and Mary. But then these things got resolved, and they understood that the Church of the East became a scapegoat of the political rivalry, the spiritual authority, that one because one patriarchate wanted to be supreme than the other, etc. Now, if we're going into the architecture, so I think that the mission of the architecture, as we look at it in the very beginning, in the Western model, it was that the church had to reflect the imperial idea of the church. When Constantine made Christianity an imperial religion, he envisioned that the architecture that is going to be used should be representing an empire. And so from this regard, then they just came up first from that one model, and then so like we can see to this day, for example, the Basilica of St. Peter in Vatican, or like Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, all these churches that they were meant to embody the imperial vision. Now, when we're looking into so this was the mission in the West, but when we're looking in the church architecture in the East, in the Church of the East, Emma Lusley, who also is the architecture professor, so she documented all the churches in northern Syria and Iraq in that territory. And so we can see that there are the churches that has to be distinguished between whether this is a cathedral, and all the cathedral churches are distinguished by the presence of Bema, because the Bema liturgy was celebrated only in the central cathedral church. And then the parochial churches, the parochial churches, and those churches don't have Bema. And they are smaller in size, and sometimes so we can see also that in terms of that how many doors they have. And the Church of the East also, one point is that the Eucharist bread is prepared in the church on the day of the liturgy. So they have this malka, a first, the bread, the chief, that then the bread is prepared, and so the person in charge of it, it's all prepared in the church.
Yeah.
And so that's the church architecture includes the kitchen. Includes where the Eucharist is prepared.
Yeah.
And it also includes the site where the baptism is taken. So I think that the mission of the architecture was considered to be, that like if we look into the writings of the Syrian, the Afrahat, the Syrian or the Persian sage, they call him. So when we're looking into the homilies, so they also always speak about the church as a nurturing, feeding. And so, and which is today also in all of, the modern churches, they say that the church is like a mother. And I think that embodying of this feeding or preparing the Eucharist, the bread, and then also the place where they did the baptism and the homily was so this taken all these elements together. This is already a mystery. This already shows this holistic mystery that the church feeds both physically and spiritually.
Yeah.
And I think that in terms of that, the adapting into the local architectural models, it was purely because of they wanted the church buildings to be welcoming to the people.
Yeah.
like you coming into some architectural house or some buildings that you're not familiar, you will feel a little bit uneasy that how would I go to take left or right. But if you're coming into some place that it is familiar, so you just walk in.
Right.
So I think that the mission of the buildings was also focused on being welcoming.
Yeah. For later, Barakatullo, send me the citation of the woman you mentioned. Okay, because I know Julia will want to look at that. Another question here: is the Pahlavi scripts from Turpan, Xinjiang, dated in the 4th or the 6th century? You mentioned as the 4th century according to carbon dating, but the PowerPoint shows the 6th century according to the scholars. So is it 4 or 6?
It is the carbon dating. And you remember that when we carbon date, we date the physical material, the paper.
Right, the paper itself, right.
Yeah, so because of carbon dating always shows the age of the physical object.
Right.
But then the paleography, the text. And then, so from this regard, because when we're looking in terms of the increase of the mission and then how it happens, and if we believe and we take that day 410, when the first synod was taken, and then the autocephalous, so by going, so then people believe that it could date as early as 4 and as late as the 7th century. Because of decisive, so there is lots of debates that paleographically the archaic feature in types of letters used in a Pahlavi Psalter is different than the Ocean Pahlavi script. So it shows that it is older because of certain features is not present in the later. But then we see the composition of the text and then how, so therefore, when we combining all different legitimate views about dating, so we will just put it that between the 4th to 6th to 7th century in that margin.
Okay.
Because of definitively is difficult to date sometimes. And so we just take that, it could be from this period.
Okay, this is a very good question, because the person asks, you've shown how there's been this adaptation through architecture, coinage, texts, words, etc. Is there a specific example of out of this contextualization, a new or adapted way of understanding or of Central Asian theology, Christian theology? Is there anything where that you see things developing because of this adaptation?
No, I don't think that. Theologically, the Christianity in Central Asia always remained as an Antiochian.
Yeah.
Because, for example, among the Christian manuscripts that were found, there was also a very large number of the Syriac Christian texts were found. And one of them is the Hudra. Now, Hudra is a prime text for the Church of the East in liturgical understanding. That is the complete annual cycle of the liturgy, the text of Hudra. And so all the analysis, the theological analysis of Hudra shows that they were always according to the Antiochian school.
Yeah.
So the school of the Theodore of Massachusetts. And then, so I think that the theology at that time was always rooted in the Antiochian tradition.
Yeah. Well, good, Barakatullo. You have put on a masterful performance and a great lecture, and we just are very, very appreciative of this. I especially appreciated the use of the architecture, the tombstones, the other things that help us to show our students too how you go about doing research when you don't have the people there. I think we could go on for a whole day asking on this. But again, thank you so much, and we're so deeply appreciative. And so just to thank all of you who attended, and we will draw this to a close. But again, great thanks to you, Barakatullo, for this excellent lecture. Okay? And so with that, I will bid adieu.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. It was a great, and I enjoyed being able to discuss this topic today.
Great, thank you.